my name's Kelsey Arlen. I graduated college just a year ago. I have my degree in international studies, where I specifically studied Africa and diaspora studies. From there, I spent the past year living and working in a country called Lesotho, which, as she said, is very, very small, and it's entirely surrounded by South Africa. So it's actually the only country in the world that is entirely surrounded by one other country, which also meant that it was entirely surrounded by apartheid. So for people who are familiar with that, it is arguably the most racist system of segregation in the world. It no longer exists, thankfully. But during that time period, lots of people wanted to fight against apartheid. The rest of the world was saying, we don't believe in this, we're not going to support this. So Lesotho during that time period received lots of international aid because they were kind of the small guy inside the big bad guy. But unfortunately, when apartheid ended, so did the aid. So a lot of the things that were helping people in Lesotho suddenly were gone. So that kind of left Lesotho in this state of desolation. There wasn't a lot there. There weren't a lot of people helping. But recently, systems like the Peace Corps, USAID, a lot of people are trying to help again, and they're getting back on their feet. But one of the things that Lesotho really doesn't have a lot of is female empowerment agencies. There's not a lot of people that talk about female empowerment. They don't tell girls what they need to know about themselves, how to protect themselves, and a lot of them don't have the means to even take care of their personal hygiene. I was first at an orphanage called the Ejigwe Orphanage Home, and then about 8 months into my service, I went to a different location where I was still working with what we call OVCs, which stands for Orphans and Vulnerable Children, and most of them were high schoolers in both places. And one of the things that we see for a lot of high school girls especially is their inability to attend school when they get their periods, and it's something I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. If you don't have the means to take care of yourself, if you don't have pads, you don't have anything like that, a lot of them would just stay home because they had no means to stay clean, and they would be embarrassed by it. That even happened at the orphanage we were at. We couldn't always afford the personal hygiene products that they needed. So someone from my church at Hope Lutheran in Farmington Hills messaged me and said that they had done a pantry drive to get underwear for you guys to create kits, and said that it might ask if it was something that I would be interested in, and they put me in touch with Susan, which was wonderful. And that's where my involvement with Jays for Girls began. So then I took the online course. You guys created and sent us so many wonderful kits. And then in January, I did the first distributions. What was really cool about that is the woman that I had translating for me, her name is Daneo, and she was kind of like my Lesotho mother, but she works for the Queen, so she was under her in some way, but they know each other decently well. And we were so lucky because she came to the distribution, she heard about everything that I did as far as taking the courses, and then obviously she was the one translating, and she was so overwhelmed and impressed with everything that we were doing, everything the girls learned. She even went off saying how much she had learned through it, things that she hadn't been told, and was just talking how much this is really a need in Lesotho for these girls specifically. They don't get sex education, they don't get to hear health education, and then at the end they get something that's sustainable and good, and they feel empowered, which was really, really cool. So she was talking about how she knew the Queen and knew that she was doing something sort of similar in Lesotho, and that she was really trying to get every girl to have a sustainable access to sanitary pads so that they could go to school. Once they were using the disposable ones, there's not a trash system there, so there was no means for them to dispose them in a safe, healthy way. And they were too expensive, so they couldn't get them to a lot of the rural communities. So she talked to the Queen about sort of what we did. She talked about the self-defense courses, just what they were learning about their own bodies and their own safety. And the Queen was so interested in it that she then invited Daneo and myself to the palace to give a presentation there. But unfortunately, a few days before we were supposed to do that, she had to cancel. But she thought it was so important to hear about Days for Girls, to hear about what we were doing and this information, that she sent her husband instead. So we had a meeting with the kids. And he was wonderful. He asked a lot of really great questions. He was really impressed with Days for Girls, loved hearing about it. He was talking about how much of a need it really is. He was going to pass the information on to his wife, and then they were going to see how they could continue to do that and broaden the scope of Days for Girls and just female empowerment, health education throughout the country, which was really great. I did 2 distributions while I was there for about a total of 30 girls.
How excited were the girls?
They were very excited, and it was amazing to me the questions that they asked, because you would think that they would know certain things just from going through school, but they were asking me questions like, how are twins created versus a single baby? They very much believe that you could not get pregnant if you were using a condom, things like that. And so the education part of it, they were very interested in, and I think they left definitely learning something that could potentially protect them in the future, which was great. They also loved the self-defense portion of it, which I personally loved teaching. So that was great. And then afterwards, they were even wearing their kids like backpacks and like walking around and just smiling. And so I think they really enjoyed it, and they were happy to have something that was for them as well. Okay.
What were the age groups of the girls?
I think the youngest we had was 12, and they went up to about 22, which is a normal high school age. Most kids there, I would say, graduate about 21 or 22 from high school if they're able to get that far in education.
That you were there, like, or were you funded by somebody? Were you under the direction of what?
I was sponsored by the Springfield Rotary Club, which is part of the Rotary Club International. And they have their hands in a lot of different projects in Lesotho. They were looking to send a volunteer, so I was the first volunteer they sent there. The orphanage that I was at was their #1 project that they were part of, so they wanted someone kind of on site to give them feedback and to kind of help out, see what direction things were going.
How long were you there for?
Total of 11 months. Yes.
Wow. Are you going back?
Ideally one day, but not as part of this program anymore.
What are the sizes of like the girls?
The average size I think that we used was a size 14. Yeah, they were bigger girls, which was good. We had some that were thinner, but I think as a population their hips are wide as well, so they needed some of the larger sizes too.
Why do the children there end up in an orphanage?
The HIV/AIDS rate is the 3rd highest in the world. It's about 24% of the population countrywide. The place I was at specifically, the rural communities are about 35 to 40% of the population is HIV positive. So obviously that's an incredibly high number, and a lot of these people who have passed on from it are parents. So a lot of the children then have to go to orphanages, or they have to stay with grandparents, but unfortunately grandparents can't work, so then it becomes they still are looking for some place to sponsor them. Education in Lesotho is, primary school is free, but if you want to go to high school, you have to pay your school fees, and you have to have uniforms and all that sort of thing, so a lot of times grandparents or extended family can't pay for that as well. So sometimes they'll have extended family, but they still end up in an orphanage because that's where they can get their school fees paid for.
Culturally, is it a polygamous society or not?
It used to be, but it's not really anymore. They're now a Catholic state, so they kind of follow the Catholic Church, but traditionally they were. So they're still occasionally you'll see somebody who does follow polygamy, but not generally.
Do they have access to birth control at all?
Sometimes. It depends where you live. In the rural communities, not really. A lot of the clinics are Catholic clinics, and they're forbidden to distribute any form of birth control, which is a bit frustrating. Even for the people who work at the clinic, they have a hard time with that. But there are places in the capital city where you can get it. The problem is a lot of people can't make the drive to the capital city to get it, and there's a big stigma around using condoms. It's associated with prostitution, so people don't do it. So then there are a lot of issues there, but again, there's not enough education as well, which is a big problem because even boys and girls, they don't necessarily understand the importance of birth control or what exactly it does.
How big was the village?
The first place that I was in was a moderately sized village. The second place that I was in the rural community, it was much smaller. There were about, I would say, 4,000 people, and it was still considered a larger place, but you kind of knew everyone.
And the king was in charge of all 4,000 people then?
The king is in charge. It's a constitutional monarchy, so he's in charge in the sense, the same way that the Queen of England is in charge, where she has, there's power in being the figurehead and there's influence, but he doesn't actually have the power necessarily to change things. That goes to the parliament instead, but he still has a lot of influence, and that people look up to him and what he wants, and what he believes in. People take a lot of value in that, but he oversees the entire country.
What's their national language there?
They have 2 official languages. English is one of them, and anyone who is involved with government, actually really to get hired anywhere, you have to know English. But their other official language is called Sesotho. It's also spoken in parts of South Africa, but it's the official language of Lesotho, and that's what they speak in a lot of the rural areas. But yeah, it's been stressed a lot recently that children really need to learn English because it's the worldwide language, and if they're going to participate in anything international, if they're going to get hired in any other major cities, then they're going to have to know English. So a lot of people there do speak at least conversational. So they start taking English courses when they're in 5th grade, I believe. So it's the end of primary and all through high school. High school is entirely taught in English.
What is their main form of transportation?
It's called public transportation, and it's basically hitchhiking in these like big vans, and they're supposed to seat like 15 people, but you might get in and have 20 or more people crammed into these tiny spaces. So most people walk, but that is unfortunate if you live far away from the schools because people are having to walk miles